So welcome back to our channel. Ultimately, I'm super excited today because it's been a couple months since we've done anything around our new projects at Monterosa and Turney. And today we're going to share some insights on how those projects are going. But one of the big things that we often come up against is how do we go from a finished product that you'll see here in our renderings here on this large billboard that we have to completion. All that starts at foundation. So let's go take a peek at the first step of our foundation here at Monterosa. So we're sitting here on our lot. Obviously you see a lot of dirt and you see a fair amount of rebar. So this is kind of the first step. We've actually got to the point where we're gonna be pretty close to calling our first inspection for the property. I can't tell you how exciting this is as a builder. Ultimately, there's a lot of different inspections that take place, and a lot of those revolve around the foundation. You have to be able to get a good foundation in order for your home to stand the test of time. And it's very important and critical to get these details right, because when you pour or place concrete, ultimately, you really have one shot of doing it right. And then after that, if things are missed, it's a lot harder to work with a cured concrete. Ultimately, at that point, you're gonna be chipping things out. You're gonna be using epoxy set where maybe epoxy set wasn't necessary. So we're gonna talk a little bit about some of the methodology to the madness of foundation so that everyone can get a much clearer picture on how the project starts from the beginning. So on this project, like a majority of our projects, we're gonna be working with a three-part pour. And that three-part pour is gonna consist of three parts. The first is gonna be our footings, the second is gonna be our stem wall, and the third is gonna be our slab. Now, I know that there's some other options available out there. The other two that would be most common would be a monolithic pour, which would be a one-part pour, and then there would also be a post-tension slab. But ultimately, I feel like you get the best result with a three-part pour, which has been standard within the industry for decades, if not longer. So the first step is gonna be prep work. What we're gonna end up doing is we're gonna have our surveyor out, we're gonna make sure that we have our property corners, or maybe even our building corners if we have a complex shaped lot. And ultimately that's gonna allow us to make sure that we get the placement of the concrete correct right off the bat. So as you can see on this specific lot, we have some string lines over here that are indicating the placement of the house as it relates to our property corners. Once they have that placement, they'll be able to get an excavator on site and they'll be able to dig the footings to the appropriate depth. So that's the first step. Ultimately, the house being oriented in the proper placement on the lot according to the setbacks that are required by the city ordinance. The second item was going to be the excavation, which took place. Once we have it at the proper depth, we're going to move forward with rebar. And rebar is going to be called out to be able to strengthen your foundation and provide you with the ability to not only reinforce the footing, but also connect the footing to the stem wall. So that's what you're gonna see with this rebar as it's bent in an L shape that extends up through that stem wall. One of the things that I love about our new concrete company was they were able to place the rebar with a stringer that will be removed at a later date that allows for all these to stay straight. A lot of times we'll see our concrete companies just lay these things over in the excavation and ultimately bend them back up to place after the footings are done. I feel like this creates less strain and it's a more solid methodology to rebar placement. So ultimately everything's ready here for our first pour. So the first step is going to be pouring our footings, and ultimately this is going to kind of break into three parts. We're going to have our exterior footing, we're going to have our interior footings, and we're also going to have some pad footings that are going to be for larger bearing points. And so I'd like to cover all three of those today. So our exterior footing is going to be exactly what it seems. It's going to be the exterior footprint of the house. And the main reason we obviously need a footing here is because those are all going to be bearing points for the property, and it's going to allow us to be able to have a very strong foundation, which is absolutely necessary. However, in a lot of builds, you're also going to have interior load bearing points, and so that's going to force you to have some interior footings. And so obviously at the interior of the garage, we're going to obviously have an interior footing for that. Some people will consider that an exterior footing still, but really it's the interior footings that we're talking about back here. So as we come back into this room, this will be a garage and pantry space, but we also have a second story above us. And so ultimately there's going to be some bearing points and some structural components that we need to be able to carry that load. And so this is going to be one of our first interior footings that runs through the property. Now this could create some complications with some of the framing details. One of the biggest complications that interior footings can create is with your underground plumbing and drain lines. So ultimately we need to figure out where our drain lines are passing through so that we can be able to make sure that those are riding on top of the footing and that we can still get the appropriate slope that's necessary for our drainage. So as mentioned again, interior footings can create some complications, but they're absolutely necessary in this specific build as we have a more modular Scandinavian look or pulling from Australian architecture. So we actually have an interior footing that runs this whole distance here, and that's gonna ultimately carry the second story load as it transitions from the interior of the property to our exterior terrace, which will be located where I'm standing, obviously about 10, 12 feet up. So the last type of footing is gonna be like a pad footing, and ultimately this is where our patio extends out. And so ultimately we need to have a strong base for some steel columns that will be extending from obviously the footing all the way up to the bearing point, which in this case will be a glulam beam that cantilevers off the main property. Allows us to have this amazing indoor-outdoor space for dining that will be located right off the main living. So there's a few other components that have to take place during this stage. So one, we have to coordinate with our electrician to get a UFER in place so that the house is grounded. Should there ever be an electrical strike or a massive electrical shortage, it'll take that load and it'll run it right down into the ground. So that's one of the areas that will take place for our UFER, and that will take place over by our electrical panel. The second piece though that's absolutely 100% critical is the idea with the foundation is that you're utilizing your foundation to connect everything together up into the framing. And so while the rebar is in place to connect the footings to the stem, ultimately we have a fair amount of hold downs on this house to the tune of about 40, which is way more than I think we should have, but I'm not an engineer, so I don't make the rules. But ultimately we have a fair amount of hold downs, and those are gonna take place in two different functions. They're either gonna be a wet set hold down or they're gonna be epoxy set hold down. And so what exactly is a hold down? Well, a hold down is the item that is necessary to essentially attach your framing to your foundation. And these code requirements have become a lot more stringent over the years. And ultimately, there's a lot of different hold downs in this specific house, and we've broken them into, as I mentioned, some epoxy hold downs where we can, so that we can get the exact placement necessary after the pour. What this will entail is essentially once we have the stem wall and the slab complete, we'll come back in after things have been framed and we'll drill exactly where that hold down needs to be put in place that's appropriate to the plans. As you can imagine, placement for hold downs at this stage in the process can be quite difficult. And so I'll discuss what that means, and that's especially true with the wet set hold downs that are required for this property. Ultimately, what that means is that these hold downs are set or placed during the concrete pour and typically extend down in a three-part pour past the stem wall and into the footing. So let's talk about some of those details. So right now, none of our hold downs are in place, but ultimately it has an S-bolt that comes down about 24 inches into the footing. And so why is this so complicated? Well, ultimately, as you can see, we don't have a lot of measurements to go off of at the moment. We don't have any form boards up for our stem wall, and this lies the issue. Ultimately, these bolts need to be placed very precisely within a ½ inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch placement. So if we're even off just a little bit, ultimately, we won't be able to attach the hold down portion correctly with, in this case, like an HDU 8 or an HDU 11. And ultimately, this creates a few issues in which we have to collaborate with multiple parties that are involved with this step. Ultimately, the framer is what requires the hold down to be in the appropriate position. So ultimately, we have to coordinate with our foundation team. Usually our on-site construction manager is involved with this coordination, and the framing company. So what does that mean? Ultimately, we need to make sure that this is accurately placed during the footing stage and in alignment with the stem wall to be able to get to the exact placement that we need to attach the framing. This is a very difficult part of the process, and to be quite frank, somewhat stressful for all parties involved. But ultimately, we're working on those details, and we just missed our framer who was here to kind of check up and see when we would be ready to be able to place these hold downs appropriately. in their appropriate position. So as just mentioned, the hold downs are the last piece of the puzzle before we get to our first inspection. Ultimately, once we have those hold downs on site and they're appropriately placed, we'll call for inspection and we'll be able to get started with our first concrete pour for the footings. Stay tuned for the next step when we talk about stem walls and we talk about slab.